Lamster resumes. So, happy Lamster Furious and happy Lamster Itinerant.
Thank you. You too.
Indeed, happy Lamster to you guys and to our guests, of course.
Well, we are here to continue discussion of a very important matter. That being, we'll cross a range of things. But the meme associated with these topics is, of course, the carrot pill. But we're gonna look broader than that. I think history, heroism, Hearth, and the carrot pill. So, Furious, I wonder if you'd kick us off. What's the significance of understanding and placing ourselves within history?
Well, I think one of the things, or certainly a study with this discussion that we can have with people who think as we do, is that what is the major motivation of people who like us and who dislike our worldview? Why, on one hand, do they attempt to distance us from what is our rightful civilizational inheritance, our ability to connect with the past, to identify with that past, to rightfully claim it as a part of us and us as a part of it, which is a reciprocal relationship. And for anyone who's remotely
Oh, I've lost you for a second. I think in true rural carrot farming style, Furious's internet is having troubles. Unless it's on my end. Itinerant, are you hearing me?
Oh, I can hear you.
Furious, we've lost you. Tell you what, I'll Itinerant. This is convenient because now I can talk to you instead for a minute, and hopefully Furious will reconnect.
No, but
So let's reorder the program a little bit. And you've been
I'm back.
helping me.
Sorry, I am back.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Sorry.
Let me.
But if I drop
let's
out
carry
again, by all means, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's. I can't remember where you got to, Furious. But you were talking about.
Oh no, I remember. I remember where I was. I was going to quote Chesterton. I was going to say, because I was saying like the reciprocal relationship between us and history, and like our place in our own history and history as a part of us. And I believe it was Chesterton that said something along the lines of that, so like history or a sense of identity is like the democracy of the dead, because obviously those who have gone before us can't be representative today, but those who are alive today obviously represent our civilization in its present place in time. And we have what we have because of those who have come before us. But if we don't consider them in our decision making, in our action, in our deeds and words, etc., then that sort of epoch enduring, that era enduring, that wide arc historical scale enduring inheritance is broken. And this is why anyone who sort of has even a rudimentary understanding of the Jacobins and the French Revolution, and the people who are the successors of that tradition, it becomes one very quickly understands why these people who are revisionist and have that sort of very plainly corrosive worldview, that they want to separate us from our history, and that we're not allowed to engage in this reciprocal relationship that we have with us in history and history within us. And so those of us who are, shall I say, be it the vanguard or whether we're walking amongst the ashes, to use like an Evolian term, this is why we have to claw to that, and not in a blind sense. We have to understand why, or at least have some kind of a consistent, sense of belief within ourselves as to why we hold these things dear, but to hold them dear nonetheless. Like, I think the worst crime someone that thinks as we do can do is to confess dishonor for who and what you are. And we have seen it. We've seen it explode really in terms of its scale and its frequency through social media. We see, legacy Americans, and they've got the yoke on their hand with the ropes, and it's like, oh, we're sorry for slavery, despite the fact that slavery has origins from before the Bronze Age, long before America was a twinkle in the milkman's eye in terms of historical terms. So that's how I feel about that. And like we were just chatting pre-show, I think history, heroism, and Hearth are concepts that are intrinsically and immovably intertwined. I think if you take one of those things out of an equation, then your ability to maintain Hearth, to maintain a culture or a civilization, to uphold a notion of history. Sorry, I meant to say a notion of heroism, because to quote Reagan, for instance, as a society, a nation is only one generation away from extinction. I think people thought that more in like a capitalist versus communist context, which I think is actually wrong. What it is that if you actually have a generation that abandons heroism, that abandons Hearth, that abandons identity and history, then it crumples. It falls apart. It can't sustain itself. Is that a good starting point?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I was just pondering on that. People try to situate themselves in an ahistoric sense, like we could erase all tradition, and obviously not people in our community, but I'm saying
others.
Then there's two different other than that sort of futile attempt. You've got people who look back at history and say, so the progressives would say history was worse and we need to chart our trajectory and continue kind of extrapolate away from what was bad, whereas the more conservative reactionary leaning, of course, is to return, to find what was effective in the past that led to the positive things that we still see sort of fading around us. So unless you had comments on that, should we talk a bit about heroism?
Yeah, by all means. I mean, does Arturo want to chime in at all? Because I mean, we are here together. We are sharing the carrot pill. So let's see what he has to say if he fancies it.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think?
It's an honour to be on the stream with both of you. So thank you very much for inviting me on.
You're welcome.
It's funny, I was listening to your Chesterton stream with Panama Hat this morning, and he's talking about potatoes, since you mentioned Chesterton. And I thought it was really interesting how he finds such inspiration in the more mundane things of life and where it's come from. And those potatoes would have been British potatoes, right? So when we're going around and seeing all these things imported, I don't think people have so much of a connection because they don't really see where it's coming from or have any involvement in it. So
I have a feeling potatoes were a North American. Is that right? Is this one of the stories that they were imported on sort of the Mayflower?
The Spanish brought them from the Mesoamerica. Yeah,
I see.
Because it's reputed that, like in countries such as Peru and Bolivia, there's something in the order of like 20,000 different varieties of potatoes. So,
wow. And then, of course, the Irish famously the sans potato.
Yes. Or the English took all the Irish potatoes away, but that's shall we say another topic for another time, possibly. Because I hate to say that certainly doesn't emanate any heroic qualities. You know what what was done there. But anyway.
Yeah. So let's talk about heroism. I think we get an evocative sense when we use the word hero. But is it just a mythical thing, or can we see heroism in history, Marcus?
Doubtlessly. And I think that's actually one of the fundamental reasons why, shall I say, those with malfeasant intent wish to disassociate us from our history and from our own understandings of history that have come down through the ages. And there's I have a few favorite examples, and I'm happy to just run through them quickly. But what I just wanted to say before I got there was that this is also why, too, what we've seen in current year, those heroes that we have are, shall I say, misrepresented by modern interpretations within mainstream media. You know, what shall I say, where Achilles or Julius Caesar or Eleanor of Aquitaine are intentionally miscast, shall I say? without saying any more. And it's to create an intentional disassociation. It's like, no, these don't belong to you, when in fact they do. They don't belong to us in a sense that it is our right to desecrate these things and it's our right to abuse them. I don't mean that. But they are from an age-old tradition of stories, of fables, of narrative passed down from.
We lost you again. I think he was going to say generation to generation. What do you reckon, Itinerant?
Sounded like that to me.
We'll ask him when he comes back. While he's away, did you have any thoughts on the topic of heroism?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of it absent, I think, in like our current discourse, right? You can see with the pandemic, they had to lionize people sitting on the sofa. Kind of replacement, like, because it's so out, like, what else could be seen elsewhere? I suppose they were talking about doctors and things like that, but the traditional notions of men going out doing great deeds. When was the last time you heard anything like that?
Well, it seems like once upon a time, what was laudable was to face death in order to live.
Yeah.
And now the opposite is being encouraged, which is to cease living in order to prevent death.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the point of that is. Like, is being alive without living in any way a worthy thing? Like, I'd rather spend a few years doing incredible human things. Do you know what I mean? Than spend 80 years in a box, sort of eking out a meager existence without love, without human connection, without all the things, the great adventure of life.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I worked with a guy. He's American, but he'd done some online course with Oxford University, and I'd get into lots of different philosophical discussions with him. And he said the Western society, it's forgotten how to deal with death. Like, it's something to completely be avoided, not talked about. I suppose in the past they'd see much more of it and they'd be much more used to it. Kind of a bit of a sad story, but he actually had a heart attack in work, of all places. And but the way he talked about like people passing away, he'd been so calm about it, and he'd already made peace with it, that we didn't really feel sad in a way because we knew he'd accepted it, which I thought was quite interesting. Maybe we need more of
that. We were just carrying on talking about heroism in general and the seeming lack of it in our modern society. Furious, do you want to take us through a couple of historical examples?
No, all good.
You're back with us.
Yeah, just as FYI, I've actually switched hotspot because my internet is not doing it today. So let's just hope my hotspot holds out.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So where were you guys? Just fill me in as to what
we were just
heroism, or?
We were just discussing the appalling lack of heroism and the way that we were being encouraged to avoid death at all consequences, even at the expense of living in the slightest.
And as a fine example of that in the modern day, I don't know if any of you guys have been following, say, the French political race at the moment, but there was an incident in France maybe a couple of weeks ago where a French farmer was set upon by a gang of youths, shall I say, and he actually defended his property with a firearm. And the president Macron actually came out and said, no, don't. It is not appropriate to defend your property in your home with a gun. Please call the gendarme. It's like, well, once the police arrive there, what manner of things can happen? It's yet another case of of the entire polity of society, just sapping out what last remnants of heroism might exist in the average man. There's actually an incident in Western Australia. It would have been the better part of 12, 15 years ago now, where an elderly man was home invaded by a bunch of like druggies, I suppose you'd call them. And his wife was disabled, and he had a shotgun, and he I don't believe he discharged his rifle. Maybe I think he did, but it was only a warning shot. And the local authorities wanted to throw the book at him, but there was actually a massive outcry. And you've got to think Australia is a society a bit like Britain, maybe to less an extent, but again, we've been through a whole political arrangement of getting automatic weapons out of, or semi-automatic weapons out of society, and licenses are rather difficult to attain, and there's a lot of hoops to jump through. Like even purchasing ammunition is difficult, etc. It is very much disencouraged, right? So it's very much not like America. And this elderly man, he would have been in his like 70s, right? Like I'm talking properly an elderly man with a disabled wife. And it took a massive outcry of people just saying, listen, okay, fair enough, this isn't America, this is Australia. But an old Italian man with a disabled wife who lives on a vineyard, who doesn't live within 20, 30 miles of his own family members, like, and he's got 5 young guys belting down on his door. Come on, like there has to be a point where society realizes that this is reasonable. And I actually feel like the society has shifted sufficiently in 15 years where I don't think the outcry would be the same as it was 15 years ago. So that they're just examples of what I suppose you and Itinerant were talking about. Like in the modern day, this is where the concept of heroism is actually demonized, and where in what few instances it might exist in society, no, it has to be reduced, it has to be minimized, it has to be discouraged. And I think that's a major failing on the points of our elites, insofar as that they actually aspire to create a healthy society for us, which they don't. But that's again, that's probably its own tangent. But you asked me about history and heroism, so where I was going to go with that was that it's interesting that my heritage is obviously of an Italic and of a Latin descent. My parentage is literally born from within a 50-mile radius of Rome. So, and I've got like a smattering of Southern Italian in me. So I'm very much what some would call a mixed phenotype person. but nonetheless, the Latins had a very, in historical terms, like in the Roman Republic, you have this very interesting notion, probably not too dissimilar to what the Greeks had, with the polis and the citizen, in a sense, or a member of the Athenian assembly, and that as a member of the assembly, each of your decisions would have to be basically lived out by the person casting a ballot. So if you're in ancient Athens, if you cast a ballot to go to war with Sparta, then you would paddle off home and grab your hoplon and your xiphon and your spear and your shield and whatever, and you'd go on the boat and you would invade Sparta, because you as a ballot caster had responsibilities and duties as a citizen to partake in, and you had to, as an individual, I suppose, demonstrate a small act of heroism on your part for the wider part of your city, in this case being Athens, right? And Rome, I think, took that to another level, because I think rather than being merely a city-state, although Rome did start as a citizen-state because it expand into its environs very early in its history, there was this sort of phenomena where the citizen soldier of the Republican army, certainly after the Gallic disaster of 390, where this is part of my namesake, Marcus Furius Camillus, and when Brennus invaded Rome and captured all the city except for what they call the Capitolina, like the hilltop part of Rome, where the Senate was, and the government buildings, etc. And the Gauls had basically torched the rest of the city and murdered a good deal of the population. And Marcus Furius, who'd actually been exiled for some political struggle years before, had marched back into Rome at the head of a ragtag army of exiles and retired veterans and some mercenaries. And he marches up to Brennus, who was the leader of the Gauls, and I'm trying to think if I get the line correct. Auro sed ferro rupa corundia est patria. So with iron, not gold, we will repatriate or we'll recover the fatherland or the homeland. And those words should echo through everybody's mind when thinking about their own relationship with A, their leadership, and B, their nation or their home, or their home is an extension of their nation, or their nation is an extension of their home, vice versa. That, once upon a time, there were heroic leaders that existed in our history that, you might say, fought the good fight or represented our best interests or sought to strengthen our community or our state in the best interests of its people, as far as that concept might sound to us nowadays. And Marcus Furius Camillus is an example of that, and as were the Romans that actually held out in the Capitolina. But there's interesting sort of dynamic between, say, like the Roman tradition, say, like the Celtic and Gallic tradition, because despite obviously my own personal heritage, I actually have an admiration for the Gallic and the Celtic mindset, like their own notions of heroism. And if anyone who's familiar with Tacitus or reads, I think Polybius might have touched on this as well, that like the Gauls and the Celts had this reputation of fighting with such reckless abandon that they almost didn't care about their own lives. But what it in fact was that the Gauls, see, there's an Aristotelian concept from Aristotle.
Aristotelian.
Thank you, Aristotelian concept that fear happens to all men, and courage is the ability to overcome fear, because it is logical to be fearful of things that can dominate and can kill men. Whereas, say, like for the Gauls or for the Celts, widely speaking, and I suppose the Gaels later in history with the Irish and the Scots, etc., it's actually more of a case of, no, well, you have to transcend this mere feeling that you have, because if you love your hearth, if you love your tribe, your community, your family, then you must act through action alone, do what you must in order to either ensure that they thrive, or that you are willing to give everything in the process of that happening. And that fear under such a condition is a choice. And that tradition actually did maintain itself into Anglo-Saxon culture, because there was I think it was Wulfstan who wrote the laws for Ethelred in Anglo-Saxon England, who basically wrote, as one of the sort of laws, I suppose, that they tabled in this document. I don't know if it was on parchment or whatever, but that a man who abandons his lord, his liege, or his countryman for sake of fear, basically loses all position in society. He's stripped of all of his worth and his family and his position, and his act is punishable by death. Wow. So, what does that tell you about the emphasis that that our predecessors had on fear? And in some ways too, the Gauls somewhat would laugh at the Romans regarding their tactics. Like, they thought that the Romans building forts was stupid. I mean, forts made military sense if you're campaigning in foreign territory, but they thought the act cowardly, because if you're worried, you construct a bunch of tents and then you line up the next day and you fight on fair terms, and that's how the Celts, once upon a time, that was their sort of modus operandi, you might say, in terms of infighting within themselves, and say the Germans, because the Germans and the Celts are quite close in their cultural and religious tradition. But that's just one instance of it. I mean, speaking of the Gallic War, because we're talking about Romans as well, is that, I suppose what's fortunate about the Romans is because they were such prolific writers. We have so many examples of this. And for anyone who's watched Rome, as in HBO's Rome, the series, the main characters are Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo, and we know about them because of Caesar's commentaries, and we write about the exploits of these men. I mean, obviously the show creates a whole bunch of tangents, and there's a lot of artistic license for narrative's sake, but I mean, it's the core concept that these two centurions were a very fabled part of their legion they served in. And another one that actually is written about in Caesar's commentaries, if you ever read De Bello Gallico and De Bello Civilis, about civil war and the Gallic War, respectively, is that there's a centurion by the name of Gaius Crastinus. Now, he's the centurion who actually leads the charge, the Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar fights Pompey. Now, he actually doesn't survive the battle. He's actually one of the first casualties. He cops a javelin in the face, which you can imagine would be painful. But Caesar actually mourns his death when he's informed of Crastinus being killed on the plains of Pharsalus, because Caesar actually doesn't suffer too many casualties of Pharsalus, but Crassus is one casualty. Caesar is said to have wept. You got to think Caesar he would become the most powerful man in Rome. He would become, for all intents and purposes, the elected dictator of Rome. Who would he to cry about a mere centurion? But he does, because he recognizes his value. And I mean, Caesar was a man of letters and of learning. He would have understood, like he grew up in a tradition where he learnt about people like Pyrrhus of Epirus, like Alexander the Great, and even in the Roman context before him, of Marcus Furius, of Quintus Fabius Maximus, of Scipio Africanus. And someone as small as Gaius Crastinus was an exemplar of that. Now, I've just sort of shot off a few examples for you guys here and for the chat. But why is this not common knowledge? Like, this should be as well known. I mean, I would like to say the Song of Roland, but the Song of Roland now, which is of the Frankish tradition in the early, period where, when the Muslims invaded through Spain and into, Charles Martel, that sort of thing. Like Roland was once a popular song in medieval Europe, and now, unless you've studied history or you've studied European sort of musical culture, you would never come across a Song of Roland. These legacies exist for good reason, and they're absolutely healthy, and they are essential. There is a reason why in the Islamic tradition, Khalid ibn al-Walid, who was a general who absolutely smacked the Romans and the Sassanid Persians around, he didn't lose a battle. He was actually a fabulous warrior in his own right. But he's a legend even today in the Arabic world. The early leaders, like Ali, for instance, and some of the other generals, because there's just a lot of them. But, like all those period generals from the Rashidun Caliphate today are still honored in Arabic culture, in Islamic culture. Why? Because it is a mooring for them. It's a source of strength for them. It is an inspiration for them.
Wow,
that's interesting. Go on, Internet.
Well, I was going to say it's quite interesting that other cultures pick up other heroes and they can respect what they see as good values, maybe possibly even universal. Maybe something universal to it.
Yes, I was just pondering that the history that I remember learning, during my education, mostly seemed to focus on the fact that that the past was a horrible place. In particular, the people who we were taught about did terrible things, and we should define ourselves in opposition to that. Like the only people who mattered were those who changed the course of history, made things different. Like you get the impression the further you go backwards, the worse things get. But these figures that you described, the heroes, the heroes of old, you get the impression that that's teaching people the value of defending, of furthering what already exists. I don't remember being taught about anybody when I was younger who would be held up as an example of, like, this is an English or a British person who you should aspire to be like try hold this person up. Whereas these great heroes that you described all sound very inspiring, and it's little wonder that people without inspiration are so easily lulled into a life of short-term pleasure.
Yeah, exactly right. And think even in English tradition as well, there are some very profound examples all across time. I mean, and this is what's frustrating about this topic is that, in World War II, right? I think it was of the British commanders or someone was referred to as Boudicca's boys, or Boudicca's boys or whatever. So they would conjure up that image because there was a spectre on the horizon they had to fight. Like that boogeyman had to be created. And yes, we will source British, historical examples to inspire the population, the troops. But there will always be sort of some avenue via revisionism, via sort of this sort of self-loathing culture that we find ourselves embedded in, that will somehow demonize Boudicca, that will somehow demonize, Alfred the Great, And I mean, if you're of Anglo-Saxon English descent, right, then Alfred is a fundamental part of your identity. You know, he'd be no different to you than say what Julius Caesar is to me, as an example, right? And even in more recent times, I mean, although I know Richard the Lionheart technically didn't speak English, and Beth spent, I don't think he even spent a calendar year in England in the duration of his rule, but the story behind Richard the Lionheart is so fascinating and so vivid and so, you know, wondrous. You know, like the idea that a man would jump out of ship in full armor, wade through the East Mediterranean in waist-high seawater at Accra, leading 100 knights, and that the mere thought of his presence, of him leading even more troops, petrified the Saracens so much that they actually fled the city. I mean, that's a person who's a once-in-a-generation figure. And I mean, he was fighting a person who, on the Arabic side, on the Islamic side, was a once-in-a-generation figure in himself, in Saladin, who was the man who recaptured Jerusalem for the Arabs. So, you know, and then again, you know, the only time you ever come across Richard the Lionheart is, well, he comes back to England because Robert of Locksley, who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, you know, returned to the kingdom, and King John was suppressed, and blah blah blah. Like, it's only through Robin Hood that Richard's important, not that Richard himself is important, but he should be important in his own right, you know. And again, I've touched on the Crusades a little bit, and the Crusades are an instance of European heroism in protecting European culture and civilization. You know, there's never any context around, oh, the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, of the East Roman Empire, collapsed, and the emperor Alexios Komnenos, who was leading a recovery of his own, which we call the Komnenian Restoration in Byzantological terms, you know, that he actually sent emissaries to the West, you know, to the Pope, saying, we need assistance against these people who are, you know, incurring upon our land, you know, what was Roman territory, which was Christian territory, and we are asking our fellow Christians to help us. And for the first 150 years of the Crusader period, there was largely cooperation between East and West. It was a European ideal to sort of re-liberate these territories that were formerly Roman, formerly European, and to sort of keep the adversary at bay. But we're never allowed to have that context. It's like, no, we've gone into their land, we've massacred them, we've assaulted them. You know, Antioch and Latakia and Tyre, it's theirs. It's always been theirs, and we've gone there and we've killed them on their land. And it's this intentional misconstruction and misrepresentation of the facts that then alienates us from our history and cultivates a sense of guilt in those who don't know better.
And then lastly, Hearth. So what's the significance? What do you mean by Hearth, and what's the significance of that?
Well, Hearth will play into the carrot pill extensively, because I know that's probably why the two of us are here, by and large. And, you know, I think in some ways, right, you can be a hero domestically. At the very least, we all, you know, and those of us who have a Christian background and a Christian mindset and a religious, you know, faith, we understand that we humans have frailties, and we humans are imperfect, and that we do commit sin, and that we make error throughout the course of our lives. And that's why in the Christian tradition we have notions of contrition and repentance and the forgiveness of sins, and that, you know, we go to confession and we ease our burdens and we try to learn from them. We hope for a spiritual guidance to better ourselves through life. And I mean, for those who aren't Christian who are watching, you know, not that I'm familiar with paganism and like pagan traditions of it, but I mean, there are, say what I mentioned before about like the Gauls, the Celts and the Germans, and their absolute insistence on duty towards home and hearth and family, and that fear was a choice. And if you succumb to fear, what that was forsaking your family, forsaking your tribe, forsaking your hearth. You know, like it's sort of coming at maybe from a different direction than Christianity, but it's that same concept of, you know, what do you value? What are you willing to protect? And taking it to the hearth is taking it to the smallest social building block, essentially, the smallest cultural and civilizational building block, which is the home. And what I would emphasize and what I would stress is that to what degree are you, the listener, or even me as the speaker, are we aspiring to be better men in our own right so that we may cultivate a better hearth? that we may, when the time comes, God willing, when we have families of our own, that we will be good husbands and good fathers and eventually good grandfathers, and that we fulfill the duties that sadly a number of our peers, our generational peers, can't or don't do, that we aren't derelict in our duties, of which tradition is a duty. Everything that, and I know I've kind of hogged this so far, so I apologize, Itinerant, but that everything I've mentioned so far, and I'm sure whatever Itinerant does chime in with here, and even yourself, Luke, like the wonderful stuff that you put up with Bible studies, and the other contributions that we've all made, you know, with AA and AM, etc., you know, that we pass that down because it is our duty and our responsibility to do so. And it is, you know, if one is to sort of draw a line across the, you know, across history, you know, our lifespan, even if we live a full life of, you know, 80, 90 years, it is but a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean of history, in the ocean of civilizational heritage. But your role is important, because if 1,000 people do it or 10,000 people do it, there's continuation. But if 1, 2, or 3, or 5, or 10 do it amongst a community of 1 million, the continuity breaks. Or at the very least, it survives in a small cadre, and then eventually it does evaporate. You know, I know this isn't perhaps the best example, but, you know, this is why when we say, for example, you know, if you and I talk even in the future, some other time, Lambda, about like Roman history, right? There's a reason why we speak about Rome. We don't talk about the Samnites, or we don't talk about the Sabines, or we don't talk about, you know, the Ferentians or the Umbrians in the same way we speak about the Romans, because the Romans are the ones who prevailed. They're the ones who grew strong and who became preeminent and attained that inertia and continuity through history, whereas their neighbors didn't. I'm not saying that as a might equals right thing. I don't mean that in that sense, but, you know, like societies that haven't lasted or have vanished, you know, a good example might be, you know, the Minoans or something, I don't know, or the Hittites. I'm just trying to pluck something out of history, but, you know, it is a very real prospect that societies and cultures die off. They become literal footnotes in history. And I don't think people realize how terrifying that can be. If one has a mooring of history or a knowledge of history, you know, like, you know, if you're an Englishman or you're British, you know, do you really want Britain to become non-existent? Do you want your language to go extinct? Like, do you want your stories and your narrative to vanish? Any thinking person does not. And it starts at the hearth, and that leads on to the carrot pill in a sense. So
yes, so it's just to sum up some of the thoughts from the stream so far. There's the concept of cultivating a better, I say hearth, but hearth. You mean like the fireplace?
I'm a colonial.
Right?
I apologize.
So, but you come into the warm, the safe, the protected, the cozy, and kind of recoup. Your family sticks together. These are the kinds of images that I have in mind, at least with that word. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I if I may use a personal example, for instance, like some of my fondest memories growing up was being around the fire at in my grandfather's house, which he built, by the way, when he came to this country, when he came to Australia. And yeah, very based and very wholesome. But, you know, and hearing stories about when he fought in North Africa, you know, when he arrived in Australia, you know, and when he did, you know, he went out into what was a desolate bushland, which, I mean, for anyone, I know we meme about the Australian outback and Crocodile Dundee, and, you know, that's not a knife, this is a knife. But, you know, in reality, the Australian bushland is a harsh and unforgiving and uncompromising landscape. And you have to be tough to endure it, particularly back then, like when they didn't have amenities, they didn't have, you know, refrigerators and air conditioning. And, you know, I mean, for context, when my grandfather was actually clearing timber by contract in order to acquire enough money to buy his first bit of land, because in Australia they had a policy of giving like crown allotments, but basically you had to have money in hand to demonstrate that you could start a farm, if that makes sense, right? So he did contracting, and my grandfather and his couple of friends who did that work would sweat so much through their singlets that they would have to buy new singlets every month because the salt content would actually petrify the fabric.
Wow.
Like,
Amazing.
contextualize that. I mean, I like to,
Yes.
I like to think that, like, I do a bit of hard work every so often. Like I've carried the occasional lamb, and like my dad, to his credit, has actually worked hard himself. But like the sheer amount of labor required to petrify a singlet through your own body sweat is just it's unquantifiable for us.
Impressive.
That's crazy. Yeah. Now, an idea that was probably thrown out, somewhat in maybe not in jest, but lightheartedly by our friend Carl Benjamin. One time when I was on UO.
Hello, Carl.
I should start a monastery and do something physical in the world. And this idea
of which there's a strong Christian tradition, by the way.
Well, quite. This idea has kind of caught in that there's quite a few people excited about the concept, and I think with very good reason. And Itinerant, you and I have talked a bit about how this could coalesce into something actual, something real. I wonder if you want to say a couple of words, first of all, about just what's the value of what's appealing in this idea of like founding something that's real and physical and embodied and actualized in the real world, a place that would be devoted to spiritual, it would have a spiritual focus and a bit biblical focus. So take it away. What appeals to you about that?
Oh, thanks. I might as well just go over a little bit of my background. So I'm originally from the UK. I moved away to find a job. So let's just say I'm living in Rivendell for the sake of it. I quite fancied, I didn't so much fancy fame, but I fancied the fortune. And I've managed to amass a small one. And it's a choice of either a deposit on a house and be a wagey, or I could put it into a business and just sustain myself. And it goes back in my family. Like my granddad actually built his own house in the 50s. So I seem to have inherited his kind of creative impetus. He used to make his own wine as well, but unfortunately didn't teach me before he passed away. But as for the monastery, I thought, oh, well, it looks something. It seems like something that's very creative, also spiritual, and something to give over to the future generations. Maybe we could start working on it and we won't see it, but just the thought of creating something that might bring some good into the world that maybe I think a lot of us will agree has been taken away. So I think just dedicating yourself to something productive and spiritually fulfilling, instead of just going to work, coming back, watching TV, fills a hole.
Yes. So, partly, one of the things that I thought would be fascinating to dig into on this stream is some of the actual logistics, getting into details and trying to actualize it, partly in my mind and partly I think in the minds of viewers, that we as much as anybody these days run the risk of being what's the phrase, extremely online. Everything becomes an intellectual exercise and virtual. And I want to just get the cogs turning. Marcus, this might be less necessary for people who work on farms, but a lot of us feel very, very distant from the realities of physical existence. No. It's like
It's a very good point. And I mean, I suppose how I first bumbled into this fear was when I spoke with AA about the precarious state of agriculture in Australia. And as a person whose sort of family's in a state of transition itself in that same way, even I've had a different orientation. I sort of once upon a time, although I've always been, you might say, of the right in my general interpretation of the world and how I feel about tradition, history, and whatever. I always thought I was going to do something in the city, and I was going to get into like some kind of business or whatever. I mean, I dabbled in marketing and I worked in hospitality, and I did a whole raft of things in the city, university and everything. Started a business with a friend of mine, went on my own way, sort of thing, and COVID, the experience of this last 2 years with the flu and everything, the so-called global pandemic, has made me actually orientate myself completely away from that. That I never want to be in a situation again where I'm cooped up in a house in a city, and that I'm fortunate that I actually have the background, both myself personally and that my parents are still alive, and that there can be continuity. And I've emphasized that when I have a family of my own one day, that I would prefer my children to have that kind of an upbringing that is tied to the soil, that is tied to production, that is tied to at least a degree of self-sufficiency and independence. The thing is, if you are an urbanite and you're in an apartment and you have no soil literally at your disposal to put anything in, like plant-wise, and you're dependent on a system of sewage and water supply and, UBI and Netflix and Uber Eats and stuff, you are vulnerable. You are so incredibly vulnerable to the whims of the powers that be. And if the last 2 or 3 years have taught us something, it should be that who is awake to the realities of the world, should not be, insofar that they are able to, not be at the behest of that or at risk of that, or to minimize their risk to that if they can, because that is actually what makes them powerful, is their ability to exploit people's weaknesses. The fact that they've been unmoored from the country, they've been unmoored from food production, they've been made distant from their baker and their butcher, and that everything's commercialized and streamlined and detached from its source. And that even the products that we get, I mean, I say this to someone, my family have grown grain for 60 years and run livestock in, sheep and cattle, for instance. And that, even when we go to the city and we see stuff in the supermarket, it totally does not resemble, what we see, or that there's so much interference with, you might say, food production in the context of buying food products rather than food. Silver beet is a food, apples are food, a T-bone steak is a food. But I'm sorry, when you buy your low-calorie, compressed pea, high-protein snack, that's a food product. I don't care if it's keto, it's still a food product. There's a distinction between food and food products. And even me, as fastidious as I am, because I have that background, with cooking and chefing and stuff, I know where to source good food. I sometimes look at an ingredients list and go, oh no, it's got that ingredient, it's got that ingredient. It happens to the best of us. But with most people being distant from that, it's hard for them to cultivate the knowledge to know what things are right for them. Be it something as simple as food, or be it even something as long-term as what lifestyle is best for me, what lifestyle is best for my family. These things all intertwine, and sort of when I jokingly suggested to the title, sort of like, history, heroism, Hearth, they all sort of in their own way tie into the carrot pill. Because take, for example, and I actually noticed our friend Lady Charlotte's in the chat, and hello, Charlotte. But, she's been in Melbourne the last few years, and I mean, Melbourne's one of the worst cities in Australia for this in terms of, density and, diversity being their strength, etc. And what was I going with that? Just being in that miasma and being vulnerable to the way that the powers of be have organized society puts you in a terrible position. And if you have it within you to just say, you know what, I don't need to live in a city. I'm going to move out to a satellite town. I'm going to move an hour away or 2 hours away, or, I'm going to take a teaching job. It might pay me 10% less in this town that's halfway across the state, but I'll do it because I'll be in a town where cost of living is a lot less, or my kids will have more freedom, or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a small act of heroism. when people say, like, revolt against the modern world, or, like I said, you'd be furious against the modern world, um, yeah, it is little acts of heroism add up. And that's what I say, like, you don't need to be Lysander, you don't need to be Alexander the Great, you don't need to be, uh, uh, Henry V. Like, not everyone is a warrior king, right? And that's fine. Like, you don't need to, have your longsword bloodied and your chainmail broken and, have 12 arrows sticking out of your shield. Like, that's not everybody. But small little acts of heroism matter. Small acts of heroism continue your history and your heritage. Small little acts of heritage maintain your hearth and your community and your family. And a small act of heroism will allow you to make your way to living something resembling the carrot pill, which I suppose is how we sort of round out the title of this stream.
Perfect. I wonder if it would be great to talk through something of the resources that you've sent me. Do you want to talk? Why don't you pick? What's a good place to go next?
I think the main document with the 5 pages of stuff going over like what monster is.
Let me share the first. So the one with zoning in the top right is the first thing. Is that right?
I think. Oh no, that's it's the word. It's like a PDF, I think.
Okay. Give me a sec. What's it called?
What did I put it as? I think it just said notes on it.
Monastery notes?
I think so.
Great. Okay. Yes, I've got that now. I will share.
Yeah, that's the one.
Great. Yes. So this document, talk me through while I'm loading it up.
Okay. So after I heard you on a stream mentioning the monastery thing, I put in the notes I've been collecting on taking the carrot pill myself, and I did some other research on what a monastery is. Because I thought it was quite interesting. So a lot of them are Benedictine in the UK. So particularly related to the monastery, I thought it was. I think this is why there are so many are Benedictine, is that they particularly emphasise the need to work. I read the quote: "Idleness is the enemy of the soul, and therefore the brethren ought to be employed in manual labour at certain times, at others in devout reading." I think everyone's heard of the phrase as well, like the devil makes work for idle hands, right?
Yes.
I think I'm too many idle hands right now. So I just made a quick list. Maybe when Furious comes back, it'd be good if get his opinion on whether anything's missing off that. So if you wanted to get going on the carrot pill, I thought you need
I was going to on your comment about a lot of the things being Benedictine. There's a famous book that came out in 2017 by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option, and it's the title comes from a quote from McIntyre: "If the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without hope. We are waiting not for a Godot," that's a reference for Waiting for Godot, which beautifully links to Waiting for Yuo, of course. We're waiting not for Yuo, but for another, doubtless very different St. Benedict.
Yes.
So the Benedict option is like finding communities in which life can virtuously flourish, and it's kind of, I think that ties in very well with what we're envisaging here with the Lambda Monastery, right?
Yeah, I think Furious can come back in.
Oh yes, thank you.
There you go.
Sorry, gents.
No worries. Where were we at?
The tyranny of distance.
Talking about
yes, these are the things you put down as necessary. We just thought, Furious, if you had any thoughts, these are the things that you would need to genuinely set up a little, maybe not entirely self-sufficient, but at least a community that can provide a lot of its own resources and live somewhat parallel. Like let's often talk about parallel institutions. So
Yes.
Land plus residence, income, power, water, and gas.
Yeah, I mean, put this way, if push comes to shove and you lost gas, I mean, you then at least hope to have access to wood, because really, sort of heating and the ability to cook is the two most important things. Because even like say with
Carbon, basically, of some description.
Yes, yeah, the carbon either in a solid state or expended, but yes, carbon.
Yeah.
But any means by which to heat in terms of being able to cook, because as humans being as we are, don't lie to the radicals, raw foods. I mean, sometimes I have a place, but I mean, we develop brains that we have because we cooked our food. And in terms of being able to maximize nutrition and sort of enzymatic absorption of various foods, cooking is necessary. So there's that.
I mean,
and particularly
the hearth, just to link back to the title of the stream, fire is this very primordial tool whereby humans can heat themselves, cook their food. There's a security, and there's a reason why the idea of embers going out sort of reflects in human experience things dying and being losing and flourishing,
and also a concept of regeneration as well. I mean, you got to think, trees perish and trees die, we cut them down, but it provides us with fuel for fire, for warmth, which heats in the winter. And actually, you did read my mind, so I was just about to touch on that, but it was a perfect segue. But yes, and I've always had this stipulation too, and I don't know whether it's a natural instinct or whatever. And I've always said this to my family members. I said I would never want to live in a house that did not either have a combustion stove or a fireplace. There is something fundamentally, in my opinion, non-homely about not having a fireplace or a stove or a heater. And I mean, like, I'm talking like in the classical sense. There's just something about it. And I don't know whether this, because you mentioned the word primal, and that's a very good word. Whether it's something that's innate and primal within us, that for millennia, our ancestors, either lived in a villa or a hamlet or an insula, or go back far enough, a cave or whatever, some more kind of rudimentary shelter. That fire was the center point of the beginning of civilization.
And I gather that this was something I was fascinated to learn about. If your fire went out, you'd quite often go to your neighbors and say, "Mind if I, carry a flame through?" Because starting fires was difficult, and armies would march with fire. They'd actually carry it as a resource. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and in terms of if you're fighting, say in the northern half of Europe, especially where the Low Countries get cold, Britain gets cold, particularly Scotland, for instance. Denmark, Jutland gets cold. The Baltics get cold. And I mean even further south it gets cold too. But I'm taking the most exaggerated examples. And heat means that you can repair weapons. Heat means you can cook foods if you're either living off the land or you're carrying supplies. Heat means that in the depth of winter, if you're being outside of shelter, which if you're an invading army you traditionally were, or as a defending army to meet an aggressor coming out of a fortification, then yes, you would require fire, because without fire, not only would you just not be able to eat, exposure could potentially kill soldiers. So yeah, exactly.
Oh, let me reshare. So just again, in terms of just bringing things, because I think a lot of the stuff that I've been doing in Lamster has been abstract and high level, and that's all important. But what I loved itinerant in this document is some of the very practical thinking of how much water do you need. Do you want to talk through some of these practical ideas?
I was just trying to plan out as specifically as possible what I'm not an architect, but I don't want to run out of water, go cold, go hungry. You know what I mean? So
that seems reasonable.
Yeah. So there's actually quite a lot of resources online that'll tell you what you need. To be honest, I don't know how accurate they are, but at least it might give you a bit of a shock. to get you
But I
to
think that that's the key to getting things done in life, is that you know, none of us feel like we're born capable of just achieving these things. Like we grow up nurtured into a system that's already running, and everything's provided by a sort of complicated system that we don't really understand. But when you start digging into calculations, you could put a number in the air and say how many kilowatts you think you might need. Maybe your first guess is entirely wrong, but it begins to move you something from being a complete dream, a fantasy, towards actual reality. And things, you know, things happen in the world because people dream, and then they have the perseverance to keep dreaming until they happen. Beer, of course, probably should have been on the essentials list, right?
Yeah.
And just on that point, guys, I just want to touch on something briefly. And I mean, we can have our gripes about the man, and I do, but he makes a very good point about this. I'm going to mention Jordan Peterson, right? But he makes a very good observation. You know, he talks about like the two disabled men that are power cablers, and like they're deficient because of their injuries, but sort of together they can make it work and they can do their job. But power lining is a very difficult and a very risky job. And he then talks about like the performative contradiction of people who say, you know, bitch about, you know, capitalism and democracy, or whatever. And I mean, we can have our gripes about that for its own reason, but you know, it's like an Antifa person on an Apple laptop in a 747 jet setting across the world, bitching about those conditions. It's like, well, you literally have all these things in place because of the system you're born into. And this is the thing, that modern society has become in many ways dependent on all this collective inertia of the accomplishments and of the skill of our predecessors, that where we run the risk of is that, and you touched on it, Lambda, about, you know, we jump into this thing where things are already working. And it's right. I mean, I mentioned before that my grandfather built the house that's on our farm, you know, and I think I've echoed this with AA before, and I'll say it again here, that, you know, my grandfather built a house. I'm sure my dad could probably repair a wall, or that he could replace a roof if he had to. I mean, I don't know if he could build. He probably could. I don't know. But I don't know. He's never built a house. I don't know. But for me, it's like, well, could I replace a window? You know, can I, you know, like I sort of do landscaping and think I'm awesome. I've built a retaining wall, you know, for soil so they could put plants in. You know, like I don't have to live on a retaining wall in my garden, but I can already identify deficiencies in my own skill from 3 generations or 2 generations, right? And you know, if things were to ever go badly, right, in the duration of our lifetimes, what skills do we actually have? Like, how many of us could build a house? How many of us could repair a gas line? How many of us can do our own plumbing? Like, just practical things like that. And I think sometimes the mere thought terrifies us. But it's a very good point you raised, Lambda, and even Itinerant. You touched on it too. But they're good points.
It reminds me of the end of Day of the Triffids, where they've got this tiny group of people trying to start a new society. There's this kind of learned helplessness in a lot of modern people, where they cannot fathom giving something a go, try it out. So some of these practical matters that seem like you would need to go to a course or have somebody teach you are not magic. You know, a bit of trial and error, a bit of stickability, and you can figure a lot of this stuff out. Itinerant, did you want to talk about what's this image showing?
I was thinking of maybe in the business sense, like vertical integration of what you can get out of the land. You know, everything's going to be based on the land, which your home will be part of, right? And kind of a joke. I've got going across the right hand side. You know, you can grow some barley. You can turn the barley into beer. You can give the barley to cows, or you can
give the beer to the cows,
which they do in some places. The Wagyu, yeah, they give them beer apparently.
Wow.
And and stuff. Yeah, I think that maybe it's a bit out of my budget at least. So that's what Yeah, sort of thinking just how to squeeze as much as you can out of what you've got as well. One of the points we're thinking about is like how how sustainable should you be aiming for? Like,
Yes.
is it safe to rely on modern fertilizer anymore?
And
Sorry.
Marcus, that might be something you could comment on.
Mm.
Like, how important is fertilizer, and can you produce it in in a small amount of land, or does the soil get exhausted?
Well, this is where I would highly recommend anyone that is interested in this genuinely to watch a gentleman on YouTube called Joel Salatin. He's actually been on, I think, Joe Rogan once before, but he's basically one of the leading American voices in regenerative farming. And I use the word farming in quite a loose context. I don't necessarily mean, you have to buy yourself a planting rig and a tractor and, expend, 300,000 pounds on, machinery before you go out and plant something. I mean that even in terms of the basal concepts that he emphasizes and he expresses, that but to answer your question directly, Lambda, a lot of it also depends on your geography. Like, say, for example, the soil in most of Australia, unless it's, say, red, rich, black loam sort of soil, which is very predominant in, say, Northern Europe and Central Europe, and of course like the Black Sea and North Ukraine, Southern Russia, plenty of that sort of soil around. That soil, generally, if you give it a chance to rest and go fallow and produce and germinate pasture, and you rest it and you cycle it, that soil is mostly okay. Your problem is when you have lower quality soil, say you have like sand over clay, or you're sort of close to the ocean, you have more of that sort of yellow sort of nutrient deficient sand, sort of sandplain country. Then you need fertilizers. But let's just assume, for instance, that someone has, I don't know, like a 5-acre block or a 2-acre block. Let's assume you've moved out of the city and you've moved into a country town of, say, I don't know, 300-400 people, and you've managed to buy a house on a block with, say, a couple of acres, right? Have chickens, because what chickens will do is inevitably, whenever you cook, and I always emphasize when one cooks to always minimize waste. Like, say, for example, if you buy some people call them shallots, but like the green sort of spring onions with the green stalk. Like, most people just like use the white and throw away the greens. It's like, no, finally chop the greens up to where they're tough and use them in a soup, and then with the green, like the tough ends, give them to your chickens. If you're baking bread, for instance, you have some like leftover flour or like leftover dough, give it to your chickens. If you have like prawn shells and that sort of stuff, give them to the chickens. It's perfect. Like leftover, you make like a casserole or something, or leftover, stew, give it to the chickens, because chickens basically turn food waste into their nourishment, and then they produce eggs, which is another source of nutrition for us. And the poultry egg is basically one of the very few foods in the world that has the complete profile of branched chain amino acids, basically fats, right? Because you get that from the white and the yolk together, which is why you should mostly eat them together if you can. And then the other thing chickens produce is plentiful amounts of defecation, and chicken manure is excellent to fertilize with. Most greens and most sort of vegetables love chicken fertilizer, and so if you have 5, 10, 12, whatever chickens, and you have a plentiful supply of eggs, they will also supply you with plentiful amounts of manure. And so if you make like some nice tidy garden beds, and you have perpetual spinach, you have silver beet, you might grow some, I never endorse lectins, but if you want to grow some tomatoes, or you want to grow some potatoes, or actually they're below ground, it's a bit different, but certainly things that sort of sprout a plant and grow off in vines or in plants or whatever, cauliflowers, broccoli, whatever. You have this symbiotic relationship between the chicken, human consumption, our waste, their waste, the manure, the plants, and so forth, and they sort of cooperate together. Just very briefly before you come in, I want to say that in the instance you ever had a cow, you own chickens in concert with cows, because what chickens do is, if you release chickens out of their pen into the cows, where the cows are, the chickens will pick into the cow plops, or where the cows do their cow sick out of their own being symbiotic in a land-based context.
So what you're telling me is that God's given us a handheld recycling machine that's way better than anything that we've managed to create artificially.
You know that meme
thinking...
by or on where like they or McIntyre says like the left inevitably like every so often they might discover something and
traditional
with this thing
memes.
to start with. Yeah, like if Oren's actually watching, it's like this is this is like the land and hearth
the agricultural equivalent
of that. Yeah, it really, really is. You know, and actually, small scale traditional farming is very much that. It is sort of the symbiotic reciprocity of different systems coming together that is proven by the test of time. You know, like we got to the start of the industrial age from, you know, the pre-Bronze Age through a lot of trial and error across a vast array of societies, everything from the Sumerians and the Akkadians up until medieval, you know, Spain and England. There's a lot of human trial and error between those time periods, and yet we managed to produce societies that, you know, grew and thrived and expanded. I want to say expanded, I don't mean sort of necessarily physically, but, you know, developed culture, developed methodologies, invented things, made discovery, which is what sort of the human, you know, particularly the European story is. And then, you know, modernists come along and think, oh, well, all those people in the past knew absolutely nothing. And here's this big machine that like churns everything, and out comes a sludge. It's like, no, that's not salubrious in any way.
No, it's not.
I feel like you need to go and visit like a landfill, and that is the place to truly contemplate modernity. Like this is the this is the kind of true pig under the makeup, as it were, of what we're doing. That because I was thinking, so fine, you can put your food waste, give that to chickens, and that's a nice sustainable cycle. But what about all the plastic that we all end up consuming? Surely and as I thought about it harder, I was like, well, hang on, why do we need plastic? Like what are we doing with all the plastic?
This is where this line of thinking almost becomes a bottomless pit, because even for me, right, like I'm the same. You know, like nowadays I actually go to a specific store to buy my cream and my milk in glass. And yes, it's more expensive. But then, for instance, because I mean, my family we make our own olive oil, because olive oil is every second year, because trees go through like a cycle of a lean year and a heavy year, and it's on the heavy year that you pick the olives, because there just isn't enough olives on the lean year to actually make the exercise worthwhile. And olives won't keep for a year, so that's why you cycle. But on our heavy year, and when we do our olive oil, like we accumulate all these glass, bottles and stuff that we buy from, you know, our cream and our milk and stuff and whatever, and we then reuse that for olive oil. Like I know this sounds like a meme, but Meds were the original environmentalists before like leftism, you know. And I do that, like, you know, like, and I'll be out shopping with my parents and be like, oh, like that those olives come in glass, or this thing's in tin, or because I've become so sensitive now. Because you're quite right, when you sort of quantify personal usage and just how infested every facet of our life is with petroplastics, and just how wasteful and careless people are. Like I literally went ahead like about 6 months ago, or, you know, 6, 8, 9 months ago, I bought a new car. I literally intentionally bought a car from the 80s because it was made of metal. Like I don't want a car made of plastic. And I actually want a car that I can repair myself, because I've actually got like some proficiency with mechanics, obviously being a farmer kid, right? Like I don't want to buy something that someone like plugs the computer. It's like, oh, you've got this problem here. Let's just take out the whole engine and replace it because it's cheaper. It's like, no, go away. I don't want this throwaway society. And it starts with something as simple as your kitchen and your food. It's if you can make a small difference, it will be there. And I encourage everyone to do it.
Any last thoughts before I wrap the stream up? I mean, I want to keep talking for much longer, but
well, you know what? Maybe maybe outside of Lambster, we could do like a part 2, because I mean I have to apologize. I have hogged most of this, but I'm very much game for maybe a sequel to this, or maybe a more long form discussion. Lander, if you're keen, because I mean, you know me, I can talk a man's leg off if given the
it all dovetails beautifully with like I feel like my efforts in this regard are directed towards this concept of Lambda Monastery, which is still a little ill-defined, but I've got quite a few people thinking about it and taking it actually quite seriously. So I totally want to continue discussions around it, being philosophical as well as practical. And Itinerant, any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's been very interesting. Thank you for having me on. Don't worry, Marcus. I couldn't guarantee my presence, so it's partially my fault. Maybe I couldn't do more planning. But yeah, I suppose if anyone's interested in taking the carrot pill themselves, there is a lot of information out there. And Furious often, I've seen Furious bring on other guests. Was it Tristan? I think.
Tristan. Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of other people.
Yeah, he's excellent.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of people out here, there, and everywhere doing stuff. If anyone's interested, I thoroughly encourage them to have a look if you want to take back control of your own life, right?
And just where on final thoughts, can I just interject with two very minor points? Is that because you mentioned the monastery, actually, it's only occurred to me before, and then I disconnected and I lost my train of thought. But in the European context, and you got to think, this doesn't exist in Judaism, it doesn't exist in Islam. To my knowledge, it doesn't really exist in the East. To some degree, I think the Chaldeans have this principle, but it's not nearly as cultivated, and it's not nearly as what's what I'm looking for, like reflective of the culture in which it occurs in. And when we speak of monasteries, right? I mean, we in Europe, you know, we have like the context of, you know, like the or the notion of the pilgrim route, you know, like to Antioch, to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Constantinople. To, you know, wherever a lot of these saints are interred, you know, there will be pilgrimages to them, you know, whether it's to sort of, you know, St. Nicholas, I think, who's located in Bari, and, you know, or you go to Rome, you know, where, you know, literally, you know, Peter, the rock upon which I built my church, or, you know, or if you're in fact a man of the cloth and you're Orthodox, you know, you'd undertake pilgrimage to Mount Athos, for instance, you know, in Greece. But the point I'm making is that there's this wonderful and vivid tradition of pilgrimage or place along the pilgrim road and monasteries and monastic communities developing products. Like, for instance, in Spain and France particularly, there's a very strong culture of cheese making. Or in Spain, they make jamon, which is sort of like Spanish prosciutto, for instance, right? And in Italy, I mean, the same thing. There's that tradition of, you know, monastic cookery, or, you know, they have a speciality in cheese making or olive oil or wine. I mean, for anyone who's ever been to a bottle shop, if you go to the bottle shop and you buy a product called Averna, which is like an Italian liqueur, it's basically a monastic recipe from Sicily that was developed almost half a millennia ago. Famously, if you travel to Germany, you go north of Munich to a small town called Freising. There's the Weihenstephaner brewery, which is a monastic brewery that I think started in 1054. I mean, that's a wonderfully long continuation of making and refining a product, and it being sort of emblematic of the locality. I mean, you know, Germans are pretty famous for their beer. Same with Chimay in Belgium with their beer making. So Lambda, there's definitely a route with that. And actually an English example would be, I recommend if anyone likes just like health tonics and drinks and stuff, when you leave this stream, Google Norfolk Punch. Norfolk Punch was made in England for like 500 or so years, and the monastery got shut down during the Protestant Reformation, you know, like when all the you know, funny stuff against the Catholics, and the Catholics had to go underground, and the recipe was lost for like 600 years. And then I think a stockbroker bought the building in the 80s, and they were, you know, clearing out the cupboards and the cellars and everything, and they came across the original
clear it
parchment.
You've got to clear it out
for Norfolk Punch, and the original Latin parchment with the recipe of it. And if you've ever taken or drunk a Norfolk Punch, and I drink it every day, you know, it's got ale hoof and burdock root and juniper and, you know, peppercorn, and it's like a concoction of like 26 herbs and spices. But already, you know, the monks of that monastery worked out something through trial and error that was healthy and beneficial without, you know, the modern scientism. So there's always, there's always stuff out there that is representative of this, and there's many examples of it, particularly in Western and Central Europe. There's many examples.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much both for joining me, and we're going to close out the stream with this passage from one of the Gospels. And they seized him and led him away, and they brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed afar off. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the court and had sat down together, Peter sat in the midst of them. And a certain maid, seeing him as he sat in the light of the fire, and looking steadfastly upon it, said, "This man also was with him." But he denied, saying, "Woman, I know him not." And after a little while another saw him and said, "Thou also art one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after the space of about 1 hour, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Of a truth, this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I know not what you sayest." And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how that he had said unto him, "Before the cock crows this day, thou shalt deny me thrice." And he went out and wept bitterly. And the men that held Jesus mocked him and beat him. And they blindfolded him and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is it that struck thee?" And many other things spake they against him, reviling him. As soon as it was day, the assembly of the elders of the people was gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. And they led him away into their council, saying, "If thou art the Christ, tell us." But he said unto them, "If I tell you, ye will not believe, and if I ask you, ye will not answer. But from henceforth shall the Son of Man be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Art thou then the Son of God?" And he said unto them, "Ye say that I am." And they said, "What further need have we of witnesses? For we ourselves have heard it from his own mouth."